One of the challenges of finding a stitch pattern that you want to apply to a basic hat pattern is figuring out a way to maintain that stitch pattern when the crown shaping begins. In today's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate several ways to plan for the crown decreases so that you can maintain your stitch pattern all the way to the top of the hat. The first step in planning our hat crown decreases is determining how long the crown is actually going to be. So typically the crown of a hat is about 1/3 of the total length. Doesn't have to be, it can be shorter, it can be longer. That is typical. The typical adult size hat is 8 inches or 20 centimeters. So 1/3 of that would be 8 inches divided by 3, which is about 2.7 inches or 6.7 centimeters. The next thing is to figure out, well, how many rounds is that going to translate to? Well, that's going to depend on how many rounds per inch or per centimeter you are getting with your stitch pattern in the yarn that you are using for your hat. A typical example would be worsted weight yarn, and that would be worked at 7 rounds per inch. And if we have 2.7 inches, then we have to multiply that 7 rounds per inch by 2.7 inches. And that is about 19 rounds. So we know that our hat that we are going to be working the decreases are going to be worked over the course of 19 rounds. The next step of setting up the crown is to divide the stitches that you have on the needles into equal sections. It could be any number. It could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever number that you can divide up evenly so that you have complete multiples of your stitch pattern contained within each of these. So for example, if I have 96 stitches and I want to divide it up into 8 sections, each of those sections is going to have 12 stitches. That means that for each section, I need a stitch pattern that either has a multiple of 3 stitches, 4 stitches, 6 stitches, or 12 stitches, so that I complete the entire multiple before I move on to the next section. So I really want those to divide up evenly because each of those sections is going to be decreased in the same way, and I want to maintain the stitch pattern in the same way. So what I have here is a blank chart that represents the 12 stitches in each section of my crown, and it represents the 19 rounds of the crown. So what I want to do is fill this in with my stitch pattern and then figure out how those stitch patterns are going to be eliminated. So it's helpful to understand, if it were just in stockinette, what this would look like. So if we have 12 stitches in each section, we are going to be working 11 decrease rounds. We're going to be getting rid of 11 stitches because we're going to end up with 1 in each section at the end of the crown. So over the course of these 19 rounds, I'm going to be eliminating 11 stitches. So if I'm doing a knit 2 together at the end of each of the section, every time I'm doing a decrease, I can represent that with a knit 2 together symbol like this. But if I'm working the stitch number 11 and 12 together, what I'm going to end up with on the needle is the 12th, the stitch that was in this final column. This stitch right here gets eliminated. That means this entire column gets eliminated all the way up forever. So then the next time I do a knit 2 together, I'm eliminating this stitch because this is the column that's next to the final stitch later on. And that is going to be what's happening, is each of these columns of stitches gets eliminated as I am working more and more decreases. So let's go through and let's add all 11 decreases. We've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, And then I have to do the last two sequentially, or the last three sequentially, so that I get all 11 decreases in here. Once it was completely charted out, you would see that this is what it looks like. The white boxes represent stitches that are actually on the needles in that particular row. And then this column of stitches is always maintained throughout the crown decreases. So we can see that in this particular hat here, where these columns of stitches are maintained until this column of stitches that contain the decreases encroaches in on them. But they're all maintained until this decrease column encroaches in on them and eliminates them. And that is what is represented in this chart here. So now we can create a chart that actually includes the stitch pattern that we're going to use. We have the same 12 stitches going across, and we have 19 rows here. I've created 4 rows at the bottom that contain the actual stitch pattern repeat. So it's 3 stitches and 4 rows long is what that stitch pattern repeat is. So we can add our decreases in here, placing them as we go up, so that we have our 11 decreases there. And then we can eliminate those columns of stitches as we go on up like this. So we know that those are going to be eliminated. So as we are working a decrease row, we're going to be working our stitch pattern 2 purl, 1 knit, 2 purl, 1 knit, 2 purl, 1 knit, 1 purl, and then we're going to work our knit 2 together. And so the next time that we work a decrease run, everything's a knit stitch until we get to the last 2, and we work those together. And so those columns of stitches are gradually getting eliminated, moving to the right as we go. And when it's all charted out, it would look like this. So as I mentioned, the stitch pattern is 3 stitches and 4 rows across, and we were starting it with purl 2, knit 1, purl 2, knit 1, so that we had that final knit column at the end that becomes our column of decreased stitches. But you might decide that you want to rearrange the stitch pattern. Maybe you want your knit column at the start, and you want that to be the decrease column, and you want it to move to the left, and you want that knit column on the right. The stitch pattern could be started at any point at the beginning of the round when you are first beginning your hat. Instead of starting with purl 2, knit 1, you could make this the repeat so that it was knit 1, purl 2 all the way across, so that you would have a knit column at the beginning. Instead of working a knit 2 together at the beginning, you would be working an SSK, because that is a left leaning decrease. And when you are maintaining this column of stitches, then it's the stitch to the left that gets eliminated. And what you'll see is you are not starting the section always with a purl 2. You are, because you're eliminating them from the right, the stitch pattern is maintained over on the left. So that is an option as well. If you would prefer to have that defined decrease line going to the left, you can rearrange your stitch pattern so that that column of stitches is on the right instead, and then work your SSK decreases. Now, in my video on spiral decreases, I showed 4 different types of spiral decreases. We had the defined line of decreases that goes to the right and the defined line that goes to the left, but there were also more subtle decrease lines that did not have a knit 2 together at the end or an SSK at the beginning. Instead, they had an SSK at the end or a knit 2 together at the beginning, and those created a more subtle line of decreases. If you wanted to chart out that kind of a decrease situation, instead of maintaining that final column of stitches, that last stitch is always getting eliminated. So the way that you would chart it out would be in the second to last box. That is where the left-leaning decrease would go, and you would be eliminating the stitch to the left. So that would happen each time. So you are never maintaining the same stitches all the way up. There's always a different column that ends up on top. That means when you are charting out a knit purl pattern using that type of decrease approach, sometimes you will want to use a knit decrease, and sometimes you will want to use a purl decrease. So you always want to maintain the stitch that is going to remain, and because you're eliminating the one next to it. So in this first decrease row, I would be working purl 2, knit 1, purl 2, knit 1 all the way across. I'd have a purl 1, and this stitch should be a purl stitch, but I also have to work it as a decrease. So this would be an SSP decrease. So the knit stitches will be an SSK, if they're pointing to the left, but the purl version of that would be an SSP. If we were doing that on the other side where you had knit 2 togethers over here, then the purl version would be a purl 2 together. For those of you who might be interested in experimenting with those subtle decrease lines in a knit purl pattern, that's the approach. And I will put all of these different charts in a PDF down in the video description. So I also wanted to talk briefly about vertical decreases and how to use those types of decreases while maintaining the stitch pattern within. So this type of vertical decrease has side-by-side knit stitches. So this was divided up into 4 sections, and I had a decrease at the beginning and end of each section that maintained a distinct line of decreases. I used that type of decreasing situation with this particular stitch pattern, which has a column of 2 knit stitches within it that I could maintain as in the line of decreases. So this is very similar to how I did the spiral decreasing with a single line of existing knit stitches and just incorporated those into the decreases. Only in this case, I'm using the side-by-side decreases that create the vertical patterning. So another type of vertical decrease situation is the use of central double decreases. So again, you are eliminating a stitch at the beginning and end of each section, but you're doing it with a central double decrease that actually eliminates the last stitch of the previous section as well as the second stitch of the current section. So this type of vertical decrease situation is really nice to use with stranded color work. So rather than having 4 sections and 4 lines of double decreases, this hat pattern has 7 decrease lines instead in order to create this kind of a wheel pattern. And the other thing that is different about this is that the stitch patterning was done for the body of the hat in bands. So within a given band, a stitch pattern was repeated all the way around, but once it was done one time, then a different band with a different stitch pattern was chosen. So the crown was planned out basically as a separate stitch pattern. In the stranded hat, I had 98 stitches. So I had 7 sections that each had 14 stitches. And I could plan out what the shape of those wedges was going to be. And then I could lay out my color plan for each of those wedges in there. So this is a somewhat complex mind-bending exercise to do, and in order to really understand how to form those kinds of decreases, I would really recommend this book, Knitted Tams. These types of hats are like berets, and they're much wider, and the wheel patterns continue for the entire circle, where in the case of my hat, I'm only using the wheel pattern at the very top of the crown. In this video, I showed you several examples of how hat crowns could be shaped while maintaining a knit purl pattern or stranded colorwork pattern. I recommended charting out your decreases in order to visualize how the stitch pattern could be maintained, and the examples I showed placed decreases at the edges of each wedge. If you're wondering about cables, those stitch patterns create a more complex set of challenges. The variety of cable patterns is vast, and charting out the decreases is less straightforward. So I didn't include cable crown decreases in this video, but if that's something you're interested in seeing in the future, please let me know down in the comments below. This hat crown series is contained in my playlist of hat videos, which include how to measure your head for a hat, how to knit a hat without a pattern, as well as all of the other videos in this hat crown series. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.